Hey everyone, welcome back to the Lever Movement Podcast. As always, my name is Evan Schwartz, your host of the show. Today I am joined by Mari. Mari, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me, Evan.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our discussion and hopefully many future discussions too. Before we record, I always feel like, in the couple of meetings we've had, we've talked about some very interesting things that I wish we would just put into the episode and everything. But we have a cool sort of intro to talk about, and then we'll talk about some really, really cool things pertaining to running psychology, injury, and then we'll talk about lever and body weight support to close out the show. But first, for people who maybe haven't heard you on other podcasts, I've heard you on other podcasts before. I feel like it's a very small world when it comes to the intersection of endurance training and then also podcasts too. Can you give people just a little bit of information about who you are, what you do, where you're located, where your primary home base is?
Yeah, I feel you. Running seems to be a village sometimes, spanning all over the world. You know, everywhere you can find somebody who kind of knows about running and who knows you. That's the beauty about it. So, my name is Mari. I'm a distance runner. I run everything from 5K to the marathon. And I also still have my ambitious goals. I didn't come from running originally. I did a couple of different sports growing up, also not any like ambitious kind of sport. So I did acrobatics on horses and some ballet and, yoga, like Bikram yoga, like hot yoga stuff. And then eventually just accidentally slipped into running. I think we're going to talk about that later. And that also influenced my entire professional life. So through coming to running, I found also sports science studies, which I then started as my bachelor. I was enrolled in European anthropology and African Asian studies first, and then switched to a combination of European anthropology and sports science, and then eventually started studying sports psychology. And that is my profession now too. So I'm a sports psychologist working at one of the Olympic training centers we have here in Germany. I know many from your listeners come from the States, and I know that you have one or two major ones, I think. And we in Germany, we have a couple. So in every kind of part of the country, we have an Olympic training center. And it's very much like a boarding school in combination with like a high performance environment for many different sports. So I work with all kinds of sports from martial arts to swimming, obviously athletics, running, boxing, wrestling, judo, karate. So many, many different sports, super interesting for me. And then I have also private clients that come predominantly from running and endurance sports like triathlon. And I also work in business coaching. So I also work on the intersection of business and sports and performance. And I kind of try to transfer the things that we can learn from high performance in the sports environment to businesses and also to other fields where people are performing in their own way, which is not necessarily sports, but it's still like a high performance in a different level.
Interesting. I see some similarities for all those different things, specifically the way that I'll ask you to elaborate on how you got into running. But coming from like different sports and then sort of like moving into that endurance side, coming from, studying the anthropology and moving into the sports psych side. And then the last thing you said there too, not even just sports psychology, but performance in general too. There's a lot of those overlaps. I would love to hear about your experience and how you got into athletics, and then specifically the marathon as well. I think it's a very interesting thing to hear about anybody, but yours in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my introduction to running was a little bit unorthodox, let's just say that, because most people progress from running to running the marathon eventually. And for me, I kind of jumped into running. I always joke that running kind of found me because running opened up its world to me. That's how it felt like. And I was still in school. So I was in the finishing years of my school years. And I still remember we were sitting in biology class. I was sitting there with a friend, and she was a runner. She was also doing athletics, and she really liked distance running. And we had gone for a couple of runs together, but it was like I think 6 or 7K. We ran like super easy, and it was like 30 minutes or something. And I was doing acrobatics at that point. So I had nothing to do with running whatsoever. I didn't even own running shoes. I was running in some, kind of like sneakers, like regular sneakers, but not sports sneakers, just, with some kind of just super regular material. And this Friday afternoon, she was like, yeah, I mean, there's this marathon in the weekend. And I should say I come from Berlin, and we were talking about the Berlin Marathon. And that's a dicey thing to say, because obviously we didn't have bibs. But she was like, yeah, let's just jump in where the golden tower is, the golden figure, just where kilometer 1 or 2 is. And let's just jump in there and see how far we can go. And I was like, yeah, that's a cool idea. And I went to a running shop on the Saturday. I was like, hey, I need running shoes. I still, like, now thinking back, I still remember what that guy in the running shop must have thought when I was like, hey, I'm running the Berlin Marathon tomorrow, so I need some running shoes. I never had some, can you recommend a pair? And he was like, yeah, sure. Just, he gave me these super regular ones that everybody kind of gets when they're new to running. And we got into the marathon, and I didn't even know how long it was. I was like, we're just going to go, by feel and have fun. And that's what we had. We had a ton of fun. It was this great experience because there was no pressure. It was about fun. It was about, many people from many different countries, about costumes. And it really felt like this running festival, like the celebration of running, because it was an introduction to the celebration of running as a sport, and not the introduction to running as a performance sport. And we had the freedom to just, chat and talk about costumes. And we were sitting on the course. And then after kilometer 21, somebody shouted, hey, you already have halfway. You're good. Like, way to go, girls. And I was like, wow, this thing is like, what, 42K? And then we kept going. And you know how when you run with a friend, sometimes you're tired, but they're pushing you, and then they get tired, but then you kind of have a high and you kind of push them. And that's how it went with us as well. And we almost finished that day. So we ran the full 42, but we dropped out of the course, and we kind of like finished a little bit further away from the finish line, obviously. And I didn't start running after that, but it was the first introduction for me that kind of set a mark. And then 6 years later, I kind of had that feeling of like, oh, man, I would love to figure out if I could still do something in the sport. I mean, I'm 26, so that's fairly old, but like, I kind of don't know. If I were to think back in 10 years, I don't want to think about what might I have done, because I really liked running at that point. And then I joined a club and a coach, and then it became running as a performance sport to me. But I think it was very important for me because I'm a very competitive person naturally. And I think it was very important for me to first see running as something that feels like freedom and a celebration of very different humans and very different performances and very different bodies, and just this community celebration. And I think that was very important.
I think that is such an interesting depiction of it, looking specifically like Berlin Marathon, one of the world majors, huge event for anybody that's, seen it on TV, or in the States, it'll go on typically at, 3 a.m. So you typically wake up and scroll social media and stuff, but huge event. But it is a celebration of running, not just watching people go after a world record or watching people, pushing themselves to the limit. So I feel like that introduction in that way almost cemented the good relationship from the get-go to then enable having that competitive side about it. What did, so you mentioned like it took 6 years before you got into it. Was there a specific spark that triggered maybe you wanting to get back into it and having that competition kind of fire roar up in you, or did it just kind of happen again randomly? A friend saying, hey, you want to go run the marathon again? And you said, maybe I need a little bit more training this time.
Yeah, so there was a spark, actually. I did a gap year in Bolivia working as a volunteer in a shelter for girls they actually have parents, but they were kind of left. And so I was working there, and in the last 6 months of the year, that was, I think, 2012. And I kind of felt like I'm coming back around September. So that's where the Berlin Marathon goes on. And I kind of felt like I was so different. I felt so different through the experience that I've had in this year in Bolivia, that changes you profoundly. And I kind of felt like I need something I can work towards to kind of have that journey laid out in front of me. You know, sometimes you feel like life is so uncontrollable, or it's not moving at all, and you kind of don't know what am I doing there. And I was a little bit lost at the time. I kind of didn't know, what do I have to give the world? I didn't have that feeling yet. As for instance, with sports psychology now, I just have this deep understanding that it's something that I do really well, and it's something I can also give other people, and I can create a benefit in their lives by doing the work that I do. And it's a sense of fulfillment that my work gives me, and it just feels like the right thing for me to do in this world. It feels like a purpose, and I didn't have that back then. And I first thought I would do creative writing. I would become a creative writer. And I had some success in this. And then I thought I'd become a theater director. And I had some success in this as well. And then I went to Bolivia, and everything was different. And so I felt like running has always given me a direction. And it has felt like life was moving in a direction that made sense. And so I signed up for the Berlin Marathon. I actually signed up. I have signed up ever since, I have to say that. And I wouldn't run as a bandit again, but like back then I just didn't know anybody any better anyways. And I came back and ran that marathon, but I dropped out at kilometer 30 something because I was just too overwhelmed by coming back, and there was just a lot of stress. And then after that experience, it took me a couple of years where I just ran 2 or 3 times a week, maybe half an hour. But I always felt like this was something that interested me more, but I had no idea how to progress. And then I got a coach in 2016, a friend of a friend, and he gave me a training plan for 3 months. And after those 3 months, he was like, sorry, Mari, you're not made for performance sports, and you also don't have the body of a runner. I'm really sorry, but you should that's a terrible idea. You should just really stop doing this. And that was the thing. I then cried for a month and really pitied myself, being like, okay, this feels like the right thing to do for me, but apparently I'm not cut out for this. And then I was like, no. And then I got a coach. I texted this other friend of a friend, and he turned out to be the coach that accompanied me for the first years in running. And that kind of started my introduction to performance running. And that was also a good introduction for the first years. But it was really this spark of the first coach being like, sorry, you're never going to do this.
Totally. It sounds like you also had your own experience with that internal sport psychology that you are now an expert. So it sounds to me like you had quite an experience in your own right before getting into sports psychology with little pieces of it. So some people might have a coach that can motivate them, and that could be considered to some people one aspect of sports psychology. But I'd love to hear from you as an expert what sports psychology sort of entails and what you do in that realm.
It's kind of hard to break that down, but I'm going to try. So sports psychology comes from positive psychology. So at the core, we believe that any individual, and in our case, every athlete, has all the resources in their hands and inside of themselves to solve whatever problem they're facing, whatever challenge they're facing, and whatever goal they set. And sometimes people just don't have access to those resources yet. And this is our job. We're not there to give people advice, and we're not there to hand people their solution, because we have to respect that if we haven't walked the life in their shoes, then we don't know anything about their life. And it's a question of respect to work with people towards their solution instead of handing them the supposedly optimal, quote unquote, optimal solution. And that's like the core belief of sports psychology. So athletes have all the resources that they need inside of them. And I can confirm that through all the coaches that I've done so far in my own journey as well. Things are already there. Sometimes we need someone to help us access those resources. And then we oftentimes are called into a coaching process or into a situation with an athlete if there's a problem. So oftentimes it's a crisis. That's just what happens. Oftentimes we work like a fireman or firewoman. But we also work with people who just want to advance their potential. So oftentimes in the crisis situation or the problem situation or case, it's oftentimes competition anxiety or inability to regulate yourself effectively in the situation. So to achieve the optimal activation level, for instance, at the optimal time. So if you have your optimal activation level an hour before the start, that might not be the best thing, because then you get more activated the closer you get to the starting line, and then you're overactivated when the race starts. So to time that effectively, and then to regulate that in the way that it serves you best for the thing that you're trying to achieve. And then oftentimes one of the basic topics that kind of lays the foundation for every kind of performance is self-reflection work, self-confidence work, self-efficacy work. So self-efficacy means essentially self-confidence in action. So you set a challenge, and self-efficacy is the belief that gives you this feeling, I have everything inside of myself to conquer that challenge.
Yeah.
And then we oftentimes also have like conflict resolution. So if communication between an athlete and a coach is not going right, that's sometimes also a topic. Or underperformance issues, that those can come from the training group. It can come from a physical issue, an underlying physical condition. Or, in distance running is oftentimes deficiencies, for instance, oftentimes overtraining syndrome or overreaching syndrome. So something, under recovery and, overtraining, that sort of thing. It's a wide variety of topics. And that also makes it so fascinating, because you just have this person sitting in front of you that is a very competent, usually highly qualified person in their craft. And you get to like puzzle together with them the issue and where the issue comes from, and then a solution that kind of works best for them. And the fascinating thing is that in the beginning of such a coaching process, I have no idea where we're going to land in the end, because it's not for me to decide. It's something that we kind of produce together. So it's really like a joint project, so to speak. So it's also oftentimes very surprising. And it's empowering to witness that for me as an athlete myself, because sometimes when I have a crisis in my own running, and I can work with a high performer, with an athlete who is very meticulous in their own process and is performing at a very high level, and I can help them achieve their goal. I can assist them in their process. It also is empowering for me, because I'm inspired to see, you can find solutions for the crisis you're working through or for the problem you're working through. And that self-efficacy kind of rubs off on you.
Yeah. So it should not come as a surprise to any runner or athlete listening that sports psychologists don't just have the magical answer for every single situation.
Oh, yeah. Hello. Yeah, we're human. Duh.
But it does also help when you yourself are an endurance athlete, and you can, like you said, you haven't been in their shoes, the persons you're working with shoes their whole life, but you can have a realm of understanding specifically from your viewpoint, which I think is one of those intrinsic things that ends up helping a ton. One thing you mentioned is athletes being in crisis, and a crisis some people can relate to is being injured. It's no secret that this is the Lever podcast, and a lot of people have used Lever to come back from injuries or try and prevent injuries. What is your experience, and how did you hear about Lever for the first time?
So first of all, I was introduced introduced to lever not as an injury prevention tool, but not as an injury rehab tool, but as an injury prevention tool. So in Germany, we have this triathlete, Laura Phillips. She's an ambassador for lever, and I follow her because I really enjoy how professional and detailed and yet fun and flexible she is in her training approach. So that allowing fun and flexibility in a training process that's at the highest level is very hard, because it's very hard to go in the extreme of perfectionism and discipline. And it's very hard to maintain that balance between flexibility and fun and intrinsic motivation, enjoyment, and professionalism and discipline and endurance. And that's very hard to keep the balance. And I really enjoy how she manages that. And she's also very smart about it. And that's how I got introduced to lever. I think it's a very smart solution to, one, stay injury free, hopefully, but then also when you're injured, and it's no secret, it's part of performance sports. If you are pushing your boundaries, eventually you're going to go a little bit too far. That's part of the game. And the smarter you are before it and in the rehab process, I think also, one, the more learnings you're going to take from that, and B, that's the faster you're going to recover in the end. So I started from her, and then I'm a nerd with running. I like to try new things. I like to figure out if it works for me, and then keep the things that work. And it has just, in the short time that I've tried it so far, from September this year in 2022, it has just worked for me. And I think that one mistake I've made in the past in running is running way too much, just too much mileage. And I think in running, we put an emphasis on mileage. It's something that we derive our confidence from. And being confident means not having just one thing to measure progress in running with. And I think that introducing various things into your process where you can draw confidence from, where you can see, okay, I'm progressing, even though I'm not necessarily progressing just in one thing, is key here. And lever has been one thing where have become smarter about injury prevention and about endurance work without, loading my overall system too much. And loading our musculoskeletal system is one of the factors that will eventually lead to injury, because it's it's a system that's going to break down eventually. So, yeah. And injuries is, let's face it, injuries is one of the most difficult field of expertise to deal with in athletics.
Yeah, I feel like, maybe if there was a specialization there that could prevent people from getting injured totally, that would probably be the most popular profession, or, the highest paid or most sought after. But it does not exist totally yet. But there are multiple avenues like sports psych, where you specialize in, and then different tools like lever, or the concept of bodyweight support, that are there to support helping keep you injury free. I have two final questions to close things out. How is your training going, and what are you kind of training for next in the recent future is the first one.
So I ran Berlin Marathon in September. Unfortunately, was injured 3 months before. That's also how I got introduced to you guys, because I was in Boulder and I texted you on Instagram. I was like, hey guys, I'm in Boulder and I'm injured. Great. Can I try lever? And you were so nice to let me into your hub and just try lever system. And so unfortunately I was injured for another 2 months. So 3 months, went almost just bodyweight support running and aqua jogging, and still managed to toe the line in a, fairly decent shape, I think, but still had to drop out at 35K because it's still a marathon. And with 3 weeks of running training, there's only so much you can do. Still, I think the journey, I'm very proud of that journey. And I think that's the most important thing at the end, because if you can get the process right, the results will come in the end. And that was a super valuable lesson this time around with this injury. And then I was in off season for 3 weeks, and then I had COVID coming back from off season. And so I'm just recovering from COVID. I think I'm like 1 month post-COVID. And I'm just easing back into running now, focusing a little bit more on strength, endurance, and speed. So when I'm talking about we derive our confidence from mileage, that's the stage where I'm in right now. I am trying to get confidence from very different factors in my running process and not just mileage. And it's a challenge for me too. I totally get it. And yeah, but it's also really fun. You know, when you're in marathon training, it can get a little bit boring and tedious. And I like about running that in you know, a competitive running aspect, you have so many different training things you can do. And there are so many variables in training that you can play with. And that's what I enjoy about winter training, that the focus is a little bit different than, you know, in an immediate marathon preparation. So lots of strength training, lots of technique, strides, strength, endurance, and max strength. So that's fun, and a lot of cross races. And then I'm going to start, so in January, February, I'm going to start building towards spring marathon. I have my eyes on Hamburg Marathon, but I'm not quite sure yet. And before that, I'm going to head to Kenya, finally. I haven't been in E10 for 4 years now, or 3 years, something like that. And yeah, I really am looking forward to going back to E10 because it's a special place.
Yeah, if you want to be around the world's greatest athletes, I suppose that is one place that you can go to just see everybody who is anybody training at a super high level. And then also almost 3,000 meters above sea level too. Just getting in their runs. And luckily, Lever definitely packs down into a really small transportable bag too. So very easy to bring with you.
Exactly. Fun fact. So your colleague who gave me a lever system to carry home from Boulder, or to bring home from Boulder as a carry-on, he was like, because I had obviously my luggage already planned and I didn't bring home less stuff. So he was like, hey, you can bring lever as a carry-on. And I was like, yeah, I don't think so. I have like one big hand luggage and a small bag. I cannot bring lever as well. He's like, yeah, we have athletes doing that all the time. You can definitely do it. I was like, okay, guys, I'm going to try it, but if I have to leave it at the airport, that's how it is. So test passed, I would say. I was able to bring it on the airplane, no problems, no questions asked. And it was also very easy to carry. And so, yeah, I was convinced by that point.
Yeah, and you know, we didn't even plan to talk about that. That just comes up organically too. So I love to see that for the, you know, transportable side. The last question I have is, if people are interested in learning more about the things you do, maybe some other resources that you have, or if they want to keep up to date with the cool projects you work on, is there any way or anywhere that people can find more information about you and the cool things that you do?
So I am very active on Instagram. My Instagram handle is at Mari rennt. That's German for Mari runs. It's MARIRENNT. And you can find a little bit of inspiration there. I am not able, for confidentiality reasons, to share a lot from my work, but if I find things interesting, or I can share some things that gave me something on that day, you will definitely find it there. And I also have my homepage linked there, which says about the topics that I work with, the partners and brands I work with in a business environment, in sports marketing environment. And sometimes I also am able to work on some video projects there, or I have podcasts like this one that I'm able to join, and that I will also post on Instagram. And yeah, I think that's it. I get the question very, very often, like, what kind of sports psychology books do you recommend? And I think books is a beautiful way to dive into the topic. And I'm very honest, you can pick anyone from like a seasoned sports psychologist who works with some people in a high performance field. My sports psychology crush in the States is Dr. Michael Gervais. The podcast is Finding Mastery. That was my introduction to sports psychology as well. And I absolutely love him, what he does in his conversations. So that's a tip from me. However, I have to say, you can read 100 books. It's not a substitute for sports psychology, because the main magic in sports psychology is having someone in front of you that looks at you from an outside perspective and is like, when I look at your process, I see this. And we have this bias that we see mainly things that fit into our own narrative of how the world works. And having someone to just irritate that narrative for a little bit is the key here. And so if you're really interested in sports psychology, get a professional that you can work with. That's the most beneficial part. Books are great as inspiration, but it cannot substitute the process.
Totally. I think that is a great note to end on. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on. I will put all of those resources in the show notes where people can expect to find them as well. And thank you so much for coming on. We look forward to hearing what people think of this episode, but potentially getting you on to talk more in depth about some very cool subjects in the future as well.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would love to have a reunion with some specific questions or so.
Awesome.